Final Fantasy VII isn't just one of the most beloved entries in the series, it's one of the most cherished video games of all time, so it's no surprise that over the years Square Enix has expanded its world with more and more titles. While the remake trilogy and its associated games may seem like the latest evolution of this trend, the expansion of Final Fantasy VII's lore began long before. You're likely familiar with Advent Children, the cinematic sequel, and Crisis Core, the 2007 prequel, but what if I told you that Final Fantasy VII's extended universe started even earlier? There exists a prequel that predates them both, a game shrouded in mystery to most, a title that never left Japan and was available only as a digital exclusive, and has since vanished entirely from storefronts, delisted from existence. So today, we're diving into the overlooked history of Final Fantasy VII's first true prequel, a game that for many has become nothing more than a ghost in the franchise's long and storied past. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is Before Crisis, Final Fantasy VII's lost prequel. Yeah! The idea to expand Final Fantasy VII into a larger franchise was conceived in the early 2000s, shortly after Square Enix's 2003 merger, and during the PlayStation 2 era. The game maintained a huge fan base even after newer Final Fantasy titles were released, and Square Enix saw potential in leveraging the game's characters and world for new stories and commercial opportunities. The company first dabbled in direct sequels with Final Fantasy X-2 in 2003, proving that follow-ups could be both viable and profitable. Now, over 2 decades later, they're deep into the ambitious Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy, a project I've been thoroughly enjoying so far. If you haven't given these games a shot yet, I highly recommend them. Even better, I've got discount codes that can save you nearly 50% off both Remake and Rebirth, which has only just launched on PC. Check out my link in the pinned comment to grab a bargain on thousands of games and expand your digital collection right now. Happy savings and happy gaming. An incredible 21 years ago, we saw the first new Final Fantasy VII game since the original, a title known as Before Crisis, which launched in the distant, almost mythical year of 2004. This game expanded the lore of Final Fantasy VII in ways that was groundbreaking for the time, offering players a fresh perspective on the world and its characters, and featuring a story that canonically took place before even Crisis Core, a sequel many of us played and enjoyed. This addition to the franchise, while an interesting expansion, came with significant limitations. Most notably, it was released exclusively in Japan, meaning that Western audiences were largely left out of the experience. So throughout this video we shall explore exactly why this is the case, as well as everything else there is to know about this elusive game. But first, let's talk about its development. Before Crisis would be made to function as part of the Final Fantasy VII compilation, a collection of games, films and other media that expand upon the story and universe of Final Fantasy VII. It's worth noting that originally, Final Fantasy VII Advent Children was meant to be the sole expansion of Final Fantasy VII's universe. However, as the production team delved deeper into the project, they realised that a single film couldn't possibly do justice to the rich world and lingering mysteries of the original game. One story simply wasn't enough. This meant a broader initiative to explore different corners of the game's universe was decided upon, from Dirge of Cerberus, a shooter following Vincent Valentine's hidden past, which I promise we will look at in more detail in a future episode, to Crisis Core, which shed new light on Zack Fair's role in shaping the events of Final Fantasy VII. The compilation became much more than just a sequel film. It was a full-fledged expansion of a legend, and Before Crisis would be part of this expansion. Before Crisis was born from an idea by Tetsuya Nomura, one of the key figures behind Final Fantasy VII and its expanded universe. Back in the days of the original game, he created the now iconic designs for Cloud Strife, Sephiroth, Aerith Gainsborough, and the rest of the cast, but his legacy would be massively expanded upon after becoming the creator and director of the Kingdom Hearts series, becoming one of Square Enix's biggest franchises. Today, he serves as a co-director for the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy, reimagining the beloved RPG with modern visuals and gameplay, but many years before this, he was spearheading Before Crisis. Initially envisioned a mobile action RPG that would take advantage of Japan's growing mobile network, without any direct connection to Final Fantasy VII. However, during early development, the team saw an opportunity to set the game within the beloved world of Final Fantasy VII. At this stage, Hajime Tabata, who had recently joined Square Enix's mobile division, was brought on board. Nomura approached him with the idea of creating a game centered around the Turks, Shinra's covert operatives. With Tabata overseeing development and Nomura designing the characters, Before Crisis took shape as an ambitious prequel, offering players a fresh perspective on the events leading up to Final Fantasy VII. Development of Before Crisis began in 2002, with a small but dedicated team of 18 core developers. Several key staff members from the original Final Fantasy VII returned in supervisory roles, ensuring continuity with the beloved classic. The game's title was conceived by Hajime Tabata, the same man who would later direct Final Fantasy Type 0, Final Fantasy XV, and Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII. In doing so, he unknowingly set a precedent that would carry through the Final Fantasy VII compilation, a system of letter-based abbreviations used internally by the development team. To give you a fun little factoid, each title in the compilation followed this pattern. Advent Children became AC, Before Crisis was BC, Crisis Core was CC, Dirge of Cerberus was DC, and Ever Crisis continued this trend as EC, a small but fascinating quirk in the series' history. To anchor their vision, the team constructed a timeline for Final Fantasy VII's world. Since the original game provided little concrete history before its main events, they had the freedom to shape an earlier era as they saw fit. This included reimagining Avalanche, the eco-terrorist group that opposes Shinra, as a more extreme and violent faction in its early days. It's also worth adding that although Before Crisis was the second project developed for the compilation, it ultimately became the first to launch. This was due to delays in the post-production of Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, making Before Crisis the first official expansion of Final Fantasy VII's universe ever. However, the game was a milestone in more ways than one, as it was Square Enix's first original game developed exclusively for mobile phones, and the first action RPG designed specifically for the platform. Initially launched on NTT Docomo's FOMO mobile devices, it represented a bold step into mobile gaming at a time when the industry was still figuring out the potential of handheld networked experiences. Square Enix had already dabbled in mobile gaming, with a port of the original Final Fantasy, but with Before Crisis, they aimed to go beyond a simple remake and craft an experience tailored for mobile technology. Learning from their previous efforts, the development team incorporated unique gameplay mechanics that leveraged mobile-specific features, such as using the phone's camera and network capabilities. For example, the Materia system in Before Crisis featured a unique mechanic that utilized the mobile phone's camera to generate materia based on the dominant color in an image. This simple yet innovative form of image recognition allowed players to interact with the game in a way that was unconventional for the time. However, of course, developing Before Crisis for mobile devices came with its own set of challenges. One of the biggest hurdles was maintaining a smooth frame rate during fast-paced action sequences, as no two mobile phones had identical hardware specifications. The team also had to overcome difficulties in integrating multiplayer features, balancing the gameplay to accommodate different player approaches, and designing a button layout that felt intuitive on mobile keypads. Additionally, they had to carefully manage the amount of content they could include, ensuring the game remained high quality while staying within the technical limitations of early mobile gaming. The music for Before Crisis was composed by Takaharu Ishimoto, who would later go on to score Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII. Originally hired by Square Enix as a music arranger, Ishimoto landed the role through an internal competition held by the development team. He's challenged to craft a soundtrack that felt at home in the world of Final Fantasy VII while still carrying his own unique identity. Before Crisis became one of his first major projects as a lead composer. To generate excitement for the game, Square Enix enlisted renowned animation studio Madhouse to create a promotional animation featuring key characters from the game. A beta test for the original version began in August 2004, leading to the game's official launch on September 24th of that same year. Upon release, Before Crisis proved to be a major success. It quickly amassed 200,000 registered users, and was accessed over 1 million times, highlighting the strong demand for Final Fantasy VII expansions, even in the emerging mobile gaming market. Before Crisis takes place 6 years before the events of Final Fantasy VII, offering a deeper look into the world's political and environmental struggles. The game is set on the planet referred to as Gaia by the developers, a world divided into multiple regions controlled by the Shinra Electric Power Company. This mega-corporation has built its empire by harnessing the life stream, the very life force of the planet, to generate energy. However, this process is slowly destroying the world and putting its people at risk. The events of Before Crisis frequently overlap with those of Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, taking place shortly after the end of the Shinra Wutai War. With Wutai defeated, Shinra cements its dominance, gaining full control over global energy, military might, and political influence. As the corporation's power grows unchecked, a resistance emerges, Avalanche, the radical group fighting to stop Shinra's exploitation of the planet. Their cause is just, but their methods in this early era, as mentioned, are far more extreme, making them a formidable enemy for Shinra's covert operatives, the Turks. The playable characters in Before Crisis are the Turks. Unlike other entries in the Final Fantasy VII universe, where the Turks are often seen as antagonists, here they take center stage as the protagonists. Players can choose from 11 new recruits, each identified by their weapon or fighting style along with their gender. One particularly notable character from Before Crisis later resurfaced in Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII under her proper name, Cisne. Since her debut, her story has continued to evolve, with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth further expanding her lore. This development isn't exactly surprising when you consider the influence of Tetsuya Nomura, who played a major role in both Before Crisis development and Rebirth. Naturally, many of these original characters are now seeing more screen time, especially with the game's altered timeline. Of course, this hasn't gone unnoticed by Rebirth's critics. Some players have been vocal about their frustration, arguing that the game's combat and storytelling feels increasingly like Kingdom Hearts. But hey, that's a debate for another time. In Before Crisis, the Turks are initially led by Veld, a seasoned commander, before Song, a familiar figure from Final Fantasy VII, eventually takes over. Their primary adversaries come from Avalanche, who are determined to bring down Shinra. The main figures leading the resistance are Elfie, Avalanche's leader, and Fahito, a cold and calculating scientist who acts as the group's strategist. And then we have Shears, Avalanche's second-in-command. Beyond the core conflict, Before Crisis is filled with familiar faces from Final Fantasy VII. Protagonists like Cloud Strife, Tifa Lockhart, Aerith Gainsborough, and Zack Fair all make appearances, either as cameos or supporting characters. Meanwhile, key antagonists, Rufus Shinra, the ambitious son of Shinra's president, and Sephiroth, the legendary soldier, who would eventually turn against the company, also feature in the unfolding events. In terms of gameplay, Before Crisis is a real-time action RPG, with 2D side-scrolling gameplay, offering players a blend of story-driven missions and free exploration. At the start, players create their own Turk by selecting a male or female character and choosing a name. The game is divided into multiple modes. Episode mode serves as the main campaign, where players complete missions and objectives to progress through the story. Meanwhile, free mode allows for exploration, letting players roam towns, interact with NPCs, and take on optional missions. These extra challenges rewarded experience points and exclusive items that can't be obtained elsewhere. Characters follow a traditional RPG system with hit points and magic points, determining their survivability and abilities in battle. As they gain experience, they level up, unlocking access to stronger weapons and armor to enhance their effectiveness. Combat blends manual and automated mechanics. Players can actively choose their attacks or use the action key to automatically strike the nearest enemy, ensuring battles remain fluid and accessible, especially given the limitations of mobile controls at the time. We already touched on the materia system earlier that involves the phone's camera, but what I didn't mention is that, like in the original Final Fantasy VII, the system also enabled summons. Just like in the other classics, under specific conditions, players could call upon these mighty beings to unleash devastating attacks damaging multiple enemies at once. Progression in the game was tied to rank points, which were awarded for completing objectives across all game modes. As players accumulated rank points, they unlocked bonuses including stronger weapons, enhanced armor, and additional materia slots. Additionally, the game assigned players a rank based on their overall playtime. The higher their rank, the better the rewards, encouraging long-term engagement with the game. Before Crisis featured an ad hoc online multiplayer system, allowing players to interact in various ways, including trading materia via email. That's right, email, meaning this would have been the perfect Final Fantasy game for your dad. The game also had a unique multiplayer mechanic called the Materia Aid Meter. By filling it, players could summon a friend to cast magic and assist them in battle. Up to 3 players could team up at once, creating a cooperative gameplay experience. The game also introduced a rescue mode, which activated if a player was defeated during episode mode. Instead of simply restarting and losing points, players had the option to allow their character to be imprisoned, waiting for others to rescue them. Impressively, players could be freed by their friends even while their phones were powered off, reinforcing the game's multiplayer-driven design. Several updates were introduced post-launch. For example, in 2006, the Battle Square was added, a fighting arena where players could test their skills against either other players or AI-controlled enemies. Victory was determined by which side eliminated the other, while also factoring in damage taken. Additionally, difficulty settings were also later introduced via more updates, which helped keep Before Crisis engaging for both casuals and hardcore players alike. At the time of release, despite being a Japan-only release, it would quickly become the best-selling mobile game of all time, with sources indicating that 2 years after its release, in 2006, it was still incredibly popular. This meant that the Western release of Before Crisis was officially announced at E3 2006, 2 years after its Japanese debut. At the time, Square Enix stated that the localization progress was progressing well, and the game was expected to arrive soon. However, the primary reason for the delay was technological limitations. You see, unlike their Japanese counterparts, mobile phones in the West were not yet advanced enough to run the game at an acceptable performance level. I guess technology-wise, we really did used to live years behind them. To streamline the Western release, Square Enix planned to deliver the game in monthly episodic updates, with 1 to 3 chapters released per month. The 2-year gap between the original launch and the projected Western release was intended to allow for fine-tuning and optimization. After all, Before Crisis was meant to be a key part of Square Enix's push into the Western mobile gaming market. Despite these plans, as history now shows us, the Western release never materialized. According to Keiji Fujita, Square Enix's head of mobile operations, the game simply could not run on most Western phones, which lacked the high-end hardware available in Japan at the time. To compound issues further, another possible reason was the departure of key developer Koshi Ito in 2008, who left Square Enix for Capcom, leaving no one to oversee the localization effort. Ultimately, this meant that Before Crisis remained a Japan-exclusive title, never officially making its way to Western audiences, but that doesn't mean a push to get the game overseas didn't remain. In 2010, Hajime Tabata expressed interest in fully remaking Before Crisis for the Nintendo 3DS, with plans to revamp the storytelling and introduce a multiplayer system that would allow for a large number of players to participate in missions. The idea was well received by Tetsuya Nomura and Yoshinori Katase, but with Tabata deeply involved in the development of Final Fantasy Type 0, then known as Agito 13, the project never moved forward. Years and years later, by 2018, the game had practically fallen into obscurity, and when Square Enix shut down its old mobile gaming services, Before Crisis was completely delisted, making it officially unplayable. With no ports, remasters, or remakes ever released, the game now exists only in memory, a lost chapter of Final Fantasy VII's history. Some fans have attempted to recreate the game using RPG Maker and translated scripts aiming to preserve the experience for those who never had access to the original. Others have kept this story alive through YouTube playthroughs and walkthroughs, offering a way to witness the game's narrative and mechanics despite its unavailability. Efforts to extract and emulate the game's files have been largely unsuccessful, since Before Crisis was built for NTT's Docomo's FOMA network. It relied on Japan's early mobile infrastructure, making it difficult to run on modern devices. No working emulators exist that can fully replicate the gameplay, and most attempts to recover the original files have only resulted in partial unplayable versions. While Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis has begun incorporating elements of Before Crisis, there is no official way to play the original game. Some fans remain hopeful that Square Enix may remaster or remake it in the future, but as of now, Before Crisis remains one of the most elusive and inaccessible chapters in Final Fantasy VII's history, which is why it is the original game's lost prequel. Now, over 20 years later, Square Enix is all in on Final Fantasy VII's remake trilogy, the ambitious, stunning reimagining of a legendary classic. And I, for one, have been absolutely loving these games. Don't forget, I've got exclusive discount codes that can save you nearly 50% on both Remake and Rebirth, which has only just hit PC. Don't miss out, hit the link in the pinned comment, grab a bargain and expand your gaming collection with some of the best RPGs out there. Thank you for watching, and as always, happy savings and happy gaming. Cheerio!